the question that I wanted to address is sex and gender configurations in the context of, quote, persons capable of pregnancy. And how this relates to the general topic is because I'm not going to speak to data in the same sense that some of the other speakers have. I'm really concerned about the way in which data is an expression of certain kinds of assortments that relate to language categories, not simply the quantification or the process of quantification as an assortment. And so I'm interested in how the discourse of datafication is related to dehumanization, partialization, and propertizing, and makes or renders bodies as often less than human, pieces, parts, disaggregated, abstracted, and ultimately as dismembering the legal subject. And that really, as a lawyer, is the most important part of what I wanted to bring here. And in the context of the abortion, of the capacity for pregnancy, the abortion debate, I think that it's not accidental that so many women, whether familiar with what the jurisprudence is saying or not, in the wake of this opinion, feel like something has been removed that is beyond just a kind of legal power, but makes them feel less alive, more of a machine, more controlled by others, in the sense of value extraction, laboring for others' value. And this exceeds just the question of privacy, which is the way that abortion has frequently been analyzed in the law, but renders some part of our sensory capacity as rightless, violated, irrelevant in the project of baby production. And so in my introduction on Monday, and forgive me, my slides are going to be literally what I have to say, because I'm so worried about my speakers not really capturing. I've had a lot of trouble with my microphones, and I don't know if you can hear me, so you can read me. But in my introduction on Monday, I referenced two very public interrogations of the meaning of the word woman. And the first was when Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee asked Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson, "Can you provide a definition for the word woman?" And Jackson responded, "I'm not a biologist." And Blackburn came back with, "The fact that you can't give me a straight answer about something as fundamental as what a woman is underscores the dangers of the kind of progressive education we're hearing about. Just last week, an entire generation of young girls watched as our taxpayer-funded institutions permitted a biological man to compete and be a biological woman in the NCAA swimming championships. What message do you think that sends to girls?" The second case is last week's congressional hearings about abortion and the interrogation of Berkeley Law Professor Kiara Bridges by Senator Josh Hawley. Hawley said, "You've referred several times to people with the capacity for pregnancy. Would that be women?" And Bridges responded, "Many women, cis women, have the capacity for pregnancy. Many cis women do not have the capacity for pregnancy. There are also trans men who are capable of pregnancy, as well as non-binary people who are capable of pregnancy." And Hawley responds, very slyly, "So this isn't really a women's rights issue." And Bridges says, "We can recognize that it affects women while also recognizing that it impacts other groups. These things are not mutually exclusive." And the rest of the debate devolved into an argument about transphobia and the causes of violence. But what was interesting to me is not that I'm presenting this in terms of the ability or not to define woman. It's very clear that the senator's two questions were clearly in bad faith, designed to convey something else, and that they were being constructed for a different context and a very particular audience, that is to say, a hard Republican base. So it really helps to take a look at what has happened with this conversation since. These two conversations were clipped, compressed, and made an incredibly, brief, targeted series of ads that relentlessly featured these two Black women in particular, Brown and Bridges, supposedly failing to understand what a real woman is. And therefore, there's a lot of follow-up. They're not worth talking to. They are not real women themselves, just ignorance personified. They've become icons of dangerous progressivism that has no standards undoubtedly are groomers, child abusers, the incarnation of nihilism, the death of America. And so Black women have somehow become the ciphers and the figureheads of this resentment, particularly on Fox News and other outlets, but wherever Facebook targets the Republican base. But the success of this, I think, depends on a deeper aesthetic, and that deeper, longer historical aesthetic frequently escapes certain expressions of causality and of quantification because it exists as a kind of semantic residue. And that's what I wanted to address. And that aesthetic power depends upon and drives a language of assortment that includes and that makes some bodies count, or that renders some bodies not only undercounted or uncounted altogether, but invisible, and not just invisible, but rendered inanimate, civilly dead for some purposes, while simultaneously hyperactive and too dangerously alive in other contexts. And I think that this is a legacy of slavery, not just in the American context, but as a broad colonial legacy of European involvement in the global trade of African bodies. In all of this, Black women are too often captured by stark categories that have excluded them from being thought of as women at all. They've been sexualized in a directly utilitarian way and excluded from the category of the human, not just of womanhood, as chattel, as inventory, as thick-skinned, unfeeling, strong as an ox, unfeminine, undesirable, unattractive, but able to pop out a baby in the middle of the field, get up and just keep right on picking cotton. And they have been not counted as women in literal actuarial ways. They have not been counted on census records frequently, not as citizens, not as persons, not as mothers. And consider just the context of COVID responses, to which there's been some reference, of course, at the conference. There's a distinct shift in diction between necessary workers, like doctors, nurses, and teachers, who are lauded for their heroism, versus necessary work, not workers, but work that was produced largely by women of color, particularly Black and undocumented women, particularly in industries like meatpacking. And there the emphasis was on production quotas and supply chains, on the product, in other words, not the producers, and certainly not the occupational health, welfare, or safety of the workers themselves. And many of those brown and Black women were thus not counted. They simply disappeared. And so this has a history, I think. And again, I consider it an aesthetic history, a linguistic history, a philological history. Think of the case of Margaret Garner. She was the slave whose story is fictionalized in Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. Margaret Garner escaped and ran to Ohio from, I think she was running from Kentucky. And the Fugitive Slave Act, a federal law, permitted bounty hunters to follow her from a slave state to a free state and to be returned to her owner. And you know, ironically, this structure of this law is very similar to the structure of Texas's SB 8 and other anti-abortion laws.
Terribly sorry to interrupt you. Do you mean to advance your slides or not? Because we're still on the first slide and what we're seeing.
No, I have advanced my slides. Oh dear.
Okay. For what it's worth, your words have been so riveting that I hadn't noticed that the slide wasn't advancing.
I'm just going to continue to read, and then when my slides arrive, we can catch up with it. I don't have any particular images, so this is for convenience in any event. So anyway, what is striking to me is that the structure of the Fugitive Slave Act is alarmingly similar to the structure of Texas's SB 8 and other anti-abortion laws that provide bounty rewards to civilian vigilantes to find, punish, bring back both women or abortion providers or anybody who assists in an abortion, and then puts a price on the matter of crossing state lines between states that do and do not allow abortions. So, to go back to Margaret Garner, when the slave catchers found her in Ohio, Garner didn't abort, but instead tried to kill her babies. She wanted her children to escape, even by death, to slavery they would otherwise grow up to endure. But for purposes of her master or owner, the babies weren't babies, but his property. They were inanimate, in other words, and they were an investment. They were part of his physical assets, not just part of his labor force. He could sell them, he could pay off debts with them, and he could breed them to make more property. In other words, the logics of both slave catching laws and SB 8 treat women's bodies and their issue as a kind of inventory. The former, that is to say slavery, and as black bodies as marketable chattels, and the latter, more recently, in abortion debates, valued in a competitive economy of, quote, racial replacement. And I don't mean that all anti-abortion politics are about race, but in Texas political discourse about SB 8, this is quite clearly so. Now, at the same time, there's an echo to the present. At least 3 of Garner's children were the product of her having been raped by the master she was trying to escape. And the capture of her human body and of her children's bodies was reconfigured in the laws, by the laws of slave states, as the collection of property. And this is precisely the categoric issue that gives Garner's story its power. In the real-life trial of Margaret Garner, when she was captured, the Ohio court refused to try Garner for murder because to do so would recognize her as a human agent rather than as non-human property. It will permit her to have a lawyer to testify and to raise a defense based on intentionality and mens rea, capacities that slaves were not classified as possessing. And so, as chattel and as inventory, the only issue was reduced to who was the rightful owner. And the finding that she and her children were property rather than human meant that she was held in bailment. And bailment is a body of law that, you know, if you have a misdirected UPS package, you put it in a warehouse, it's labeled for pickup and for claim, in this case by the slave catcher. So she and her surviving children were held in bailment and then returned to the man designated as her owner. In other words, in deep irony, Garner's avoidance of a murder charge was an affirmation of her complete lack of humanity, and thus her lack of any agency over any life or over any death, even her own child's. And in this sense, I think of gender as structural, and structural in a way that determines what gets animated and what doesn't, how things live in language and how we objectify in a way that is eventually translated into laws. And how we think about this in a way that goes beyond the conceptual bounds of how we think of either sex or gender is what I usually think of as sex or gender, is what really intrigues me. Because sex and gender in particular, sexualized gender, really has underlying assignments of what is alive, what has power, what is neuter, what is a person, and who is a thing, is also a question of gender. So in this sense, gender is a kind of deep linguistic distinction underlying.
Wait a second. Wait a second. The sound has gone completely screwy.
And then I'll just make sure that the correct ones are shared. But you will need to tell me which slide you want to be on.
Let's see. I think I'm on the
One
slide.
second.
Oh dear.
Yeah, that's the right. Okay. So
I'm on
which
slide number 11, I think.
11? So what I have is semantic residue. Is that
Yes.
excellent?
And I'll skip over this. I feel like I'm losing time, but basically the point is that in English we have very little regard to gender as a matter of language. But in, as a Latin tradition, there actually are indicators of male and female, of masculine and feminine, and of neuter, and of a range of other possible genders or assortments. So that in French, Portuguese, and Spanish, when a verb is used as a noun, it's almost always masculine, but when a word is used as the result of an executing verb, it is usually feminine. And I don't say that idly, there's a great deal more I'd have to say, but I just wanted to suggest that there are more kinds of genders if we think of gender as this kind of type or assortment. That masculine is a verb as a noun, feminine is a word used as a result of executing a verb, just even in the Western tradition. But imagine that we also thought of gender as non-human but alive, as animal and animated, that might be a gender, a little like Margaret Garner, or as non-human and not alive but inhabited, like the immortality of a corporate body or the vivacity of water given personhood in New Zealand, or as neuter empty entity as thing. So I wanted to introduce a broader concept of the way in which we might be unconsciously or even mining the deeper possibilities of what gender indicates or points to. And it seems to me all of this relates to concepts of legal personhood and civil death. So Marlis Munoz was a woman who was pregnant, had a massive aneurysm, and effectively was rendered brain dead with a directive of non-resuscitation as guide to the present action of taking her off life support. But she was in a state where they made a legal case about the personhood of the fetus that she was carrying. And that legal personhood was subsequently granted to her, quote, preborn child, which not only divided her from her fetus, but gave her fetus standing to contradict her will. Peyton Cramblett is a child who was the product of a sperm bank mix-up, born to a white mother who had, for whom the sperm bank had mixed up and given her black sperm a black father, and a wrongful life suit was brought based on the devaluation of, again, a post-born child. And so, again, I'm suggesting that we have categories that we don't usually think of as gender, but I want to put them within that category. So if the regulation of pregnancy is vexed by legal constructions of things like fetal personhood, we may want to consider the degree to which genetic personhood is being used and misused in similarly reductive ways to biologize political issues of identity, property, and agency. And this rhetorical tendency increasingly baffles the ethical coordinates of both science and society. So, for example, in Britain, the mitochondrial contribution is written out of language of parentage in the context of ooplasmic transfer. That is what has been heretofore called three-parent reproduction, in which the child ends up with the DNA of two parents, but with a mitochondrial replacement from a third donor or woman to avoid certain otherwise heritable mitochondrial diseases. So the language out of which it is written is parent, parenting as contract, as property, as custodial, and as control. And what's interesting to me, just as a linguistic matter, mitochondria are not just there for energy conservation, they're also figurative. They are the literal or literary signifiers of maternal inheritance. So it is a kind of writing out of the mother. And if these seem altogether too inflected by political correctness, consider how this might be tracked just as a symbolic or epistemic matter, as knowledge production, as a very directive lens of the language through which we are learning to speak. This is particularly clear, perhaps, in the emerging emphasis on gene-centricity in things like surrogate contracts. In those states or international settings where they are permitted, surrogate contracts speak of wombs or a living woman as a gestational carrier. There are cases which really refer to the fetal hotels that women labeled surrogates are reduced to. The womb, in other words, is largely treated as a room for rent and as a juridically non-biological space, like a warehouse. This then means that the owners of the issue, or the product, or the child, are the ones who contributed the gametes alone. So it's a very gene-centered notion of parentage and identity that doesn't take into account the epigenetics of pregnancy as a biological exchange just to begin with. It also aligns in certain conceptual ways with those who, for religious reasons, assert that life begins at the Medic conception. It's also very contractarian, using devivifying metaphors of real estate, warehousing, lading, bailment, spatial geography, an apartment to be rented or leased as private property, easements through. And so abortion law draws on has traditionally drawn on gradualist theories, taking into account the evolution of an embryo from non-viable to viable internal epigenetic exchanges with a gestator's body, psychological and physical tolls within and upon the gestator's body. And from this, we get a certain regard for privacy rights and reproductive liberties of the gestator's body. But these communitarian, and it also implies communitarian metaphors that extend to medicine and duties of care. notions of family. And so until now, law's configuration of abortion is within a context where the gestational entity is a person, is a mother, a constitutional being, in other words, an integrated biosphere, or entitled to assumptions of integrity. Pregnancy is evolving, cellular, processual, complexly interrelated with a woman's embodiment. And this is in tension with a rapidly encroaching, displacing discourse of much of IVF, ART, and surrogacy law premised on genetic identity as opposed to biological process. And this sometimes manifests as a concept of fetal personhood, or life beginning at conception, or commoditized mechanistic recipe, factory, Rube Goldberg metaphors in which ingredients are popped in at one end, a product pops out the other, or again, visions of a little homunculus passing through the alchemist's forge to be delivered mysteriously and magically whole. And the political consequences of this emphasis on DNA becoming an increasingly exclusive marker of family belonging is reflected in things like detention centers at national borders needing to prove familial relationship exclusively by DNA, and by nuclear family definitions: mother, father, direct children, no grandparents, no other extended family. And new contrasting formulations of genetic citizenship, which baffle and reinstate standards of jus soli and jus sanguinis in the face of, surrogacies, combinations of a Danish egg, a British mitochondria, Turkish sperm, Thai gestational carrier born in India with a Japanese commissioning parent. And all of this worries me because it is, that this kind of disaggregation of the processual nature of pregnancy is simultaneously and progressively narrowing the frame from dignitary to contractarian discourses, and as a result, a lessening hierarchy of aliveness, and aliveness as a category of gender. If you follow if you accept my modeling of gender, and again, I'm sort of decreasing the concept of mother, the concept of parent, the concept of indivisible inviolability, or the embrace, the enfolding of pregnancy from one kind of ethical regime, proceeding to surrogate, which is a substitution, a metaphor, an as-if kind of mother, descending to gestational carrier or a service provider. Increasingly now the language of third-party reproduction, so outsourced altogether. The non-human vocabulary of warehouse or fetal hotels, rental spaces, warming ovens, a kind of metonymy, a part substituted for a whole. And then increasingly this vocabulary of a woman or her womb as a non-biological geography altogether. And so, again, my question ultimately is, what kind of body are we imagining into being? And when one thinks of viviparity, viviparity is reproducing through live birth, or the development of the embryo inside the body of the parent. And non-viviparity refers to reproduction by laying eggs, so that reproduction is complicated, or is completed by incubation outside the parental body, like chickens or flies. And I do wonder that there is a gesturing away from figurations of our bodies as viviparous, as well as alive. And I want to just end with the example of Melissa Cook, who was a woman who engaged in a surrogate. The biological father, as a surrogate, she was hired as a surrogate. She became pregnant with triplets. The biological father demanded to abort one of the babies she was carrying because he'd, quote, allegedly run out of cash. So this whole transaction is sort of becomes a value added, or it's a very contractarian commercial transaction. And the father wanted to reduce, also out of health concerns. I don't want to understate those. Now, what's interesting is that the owner of the New York-based surrogacy agency, Reproductive Possibilities, said that the babies legally belong, so it's a possession language, to the father, because under California law, the commissioning father is the father, and there is no mother of the babies Cook is carrying. And so I just draw your attention to this writing out of the mother again. That this is a kind of legal fiction, but it's an increasingly powerful one. That it is his DNA, it is his DNA, and that DNA renders him at the same ethical, deserving the same ethical status. Should he be forced to have his baby out there, any more than a woman should be forced to have her children? And again, this is a realignment of the way in which legal subjects in the context of pregnancy have been traditionally thought of. And I just, to return to the question of this as a breeding contract, which has very old structures, I point to the work of Yasmin Ergis at Columbia, my former colleague, has written about this sort of configuration. It's called a straight-through theory of parental rights. And a privilege is genetic, not really full biological connection. And it emphasizes ownership, if not personhood, and life as figured at the beginning of conception. And it treats, ultimately, the woman as incidental, a kind of factory, a production site. As one geneticist wrote, we won't need women soon anyway. Soon children will be gestated in labs. Stop romanticizing women's attachments. And it treats pregnancy in that sense as product and property, as passing through a woman's body, and that parental rights in bearer or gestator can be terminated by private commission, rationalized by exchange value. And again, I can't, help but think of the contrast between the way in which we think of pregnancy, at least pre-Dobbs, and the power of a woman over her own body and the conceptualizations of female bodies, compared to adoption, which decision to terminate rights is never final until after birth, in recognition of the fact that bonding may occur whether one signals a contract or not. And the child's best interests are often at the height of that interrogation. And so for me, the question of categories of conception and egg production are also about these kinds of assortments of genre of egg production. Fruit of the womb, the gift, the infinite potential that has no boundary, altruism, sacrifice, charity, potlatch, as opposed to the non-agentic subject, incapacitated potential product, and whose value is entirely a use value. And then even further devivified is the commodity whose value is an exchange value, period. And so I'll leave with this, my concern about the referential shift, which is really one about the entire, or a reflection on the kind of beings we are, the kind of reproductive beings we are as a species, and its relationship to viviparity and non-viviparity. And women ultimately reduced to a kind of non-biological geography in a gametic value, race of commodity value. And I'll stop there.
Is that, I'm not sure that I'm on the right slide, but yeah, this is the last slide. Okay, thank you so much, Pat.